del profesor Ingold fue coordinada por el Laboratorio de Etnografía y el Núcleo de Especulatorio de la Universidad de Chile. Si ustedes vieron en la entrada, dejamos unas piedras que los invitamos a no solo tocarlas, sino olerlas y gustarlas. ¿Sí? Eso nos permite introducir un poco la vasta trayectoria del profesor Ingold, su producción, que sin duda es conocida por todos ustedes, y que no solo ha transformado los conceptos de nuestra disciplina, sino que también las metodologías. Esto nos ha permitido avanzar hoy día hacia una antropología con letras mayúsculas. ¿Sí? Eso, pues. Yo te leo la palabra de Camilo.
Buenas a todos los presentes. Voy a dar unas palabras que escribió con Jaime. Bueno, lo que comenzó como un comentario de por qué no invitamos a Tim Ingold cuando supimos que iba a venir, está cerrando hoy con la charla que el mismo profesor Ingold nos dará a continuación. Para la mayoría de los estudiantes de antropología que estamos aquí presentes, la visita de un exponente de nuestra disciplina como él es sin duda un acontecimiento para nuestra vida estudiantil. Poder contar la anécdota del día que fui a ver a Tim Ingold es una forma también de atesorar nuestro estudio de la antropología. Quien no se haya encontrado con sus textos ya, seguramente lo hará en semestres venideros. Es más, incluso si no lo hemos leído directamente, seguramente lo hemos visto su bibliografía referenciada en nuestras lecturas. Y por esto conocemos su relevancia en los debates de la disciplina. En los últimos años, el profesor Ingold se ha dedicado a estudiar líneas en común entre antropología y educación, combatiendo la idea de que la educación sea simplemente transmisión de conocimiento. En su lugar, plantea que la educación, como la antropología, debe ser un lugar de encuentro. ¿Y qué es aquello en lo que nos encontramos, sino un lugar de encuentro? Ese momento, en sí mismo, es hablar de antropología. Esta charla quedará como un nudo en nuestra memoria, uno dentro de todas las líneas que cruzan la vida del estudiante. Gracias. Disfruten la charla. Thanks for coming, Professor Ingold.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you today and to be in your wonderful country and city. Making things has always tended to be pushed to the margins of an educational system that prioritizes the intergenerational transmission of academic knowledge. And this marginalization rests on the supposition that to make something is simply to execute in bodily and mechanical practice knowledge already transferred. While making may be accorded a role in skills training or in preparing students for the world of work in which their knowledge is to be applied, this training and preparation are deemed to take second place to the learning through which knowledge is first acquired. Now, my aim in this lecture is to challenge this model of making after learning. I claim that making lies not on the periphery, but at the heart of a process of learning in which knowledge is not so much transferred as grown. And that this growth, far from being confined within generation after generation of students, is brought about by teachers and students of different but overlapping generations working together. So making does not afford an exit from learning at the point where acquisition gives way to application. On the contrary, it is the very impulse that drives the learning process from within. Now, to establish these claims, my first task will be to explore what it means to say of knowledge that it is grown, and of things that they are made. Or more particularly, this means rethinking the relation between making and growing. I propose that making, rather than setting outer parameters to growth, specifying its moments of initiation and conclusion, that making enters dynamically into the growth process itself and works to regenerate it. So my second task will then be to show that the regenerative potential of making to effectuate growth is the driving force behind the process of learning. And to do this, we'll need to think differently of generations not as succeeding one another like layers in a stack, each deemed to replace its predecessor, but as arrayed lengthwise, like the twisted fibers of a braid. And this is what I have tried to show in this diagram here. On the right is the way we typically think of generations. There's one generation, then the next, then the next, then the next. Each generation layered on top of the one before. The view I propose is more like the diagram on the left, in which generations lie alongside one another and overlap, each giving rise to the next. So I want to move from the layered view of generations to the braid or rope view of generations. Learning then carries on over generations by way of the co-participation in the productive activities through which things get made. And I'll conclude by reflecting on the implications of this view of making, growing, and learning for the educational curriculum. More than merely an add-on to complement the intellectual side of learning, mediated by words and symbols, and a manual side that draws on embodied skills and tacit knowledge, making injects vitality into the traditional academic disciplines themselves, transforming them from the inside. And with that, education itself becomes a process not of transmission, but of growth. Now, words like making and growing can, of course, have many shades of meaning, and there's little to be gained from trying to come up with exact definitions or to legislate on how words should be used. For example, one can make an artifact, make music, make a bed, make love, make hay, make fire, and each entails a different sense of making. Likewise, one can grow a beard, grow potatoes, grow weary, and again, growing means something different in each case. But I do want to highlight a contrast between the focus on outcome and the focus on process. Making generally invites the question, well, what are you making? To which the answer is whatever you hope eventually to come up with. But with growing, by contrast, it's more a question of, well, what is going on here? And to answer, we must join with the generation of things, with their coming into being, or ontogenesis, spelling out the tasks that have to be done, rather than specifying the end product. And this distinction is precisely parallel to one that the philosopher Martin Heidegger drew in a celebrated essay, Building, Dwelling, Thinking. And in calling this lecture Making, Growing, Learning, I've drawn on that precedent. Making and building are of a kind but so are growing and dwelling. So So the similar relation between dwelling and building that Heidegger was talking about, and growing and making that I'm talking about here. So what building was to dwelling for Heidegger, making is to growing for us. And in his essay, Heidegger argued that rather than dwelling going on within building, we should think of building as going on within and conditional upon a process of dwelling. We do not dwell because we have built, as Heidegger put it, but we build and have built because we dwell. That is, because we are dwellers. In short, Heidegger turned the conventional order of building and dwelling back to front, putting building inside dwelling rather than dwelling inside building. And that's precisely what I want to do now with making and growing. We make because we grow, and we grow what we make. And to be clear, this is a question of priorities, not of alternatives. To prioritize growth is not to deny that humans make things. It's only to insist that making finds its ground in growing and not the other way around. That making is grounded in growing, not that growing is grounded in making. The paradox of making, were we to take it as the compass of our actions, is that it would begin where it ends, with the specification of its final product. The thing to be made would have already to have been prefigured in some sense, even before a finger has been lifted in its construction. And from beginning to end, the figure should remain constant, hovering over the making process, until the form of the thing, now realized in the material, precisely fit. Well, where then would this figure lie, this idea in the imagination of what you're making? And it is often supposed that human beings have a special place for it, in a region of the mind known as imagination. Well, whether such a place for images, is truly unique to humans or common to other animals as well, is very much debated. Might the beaver imagine the lodge before setting to work? Or might the weaver bird imagine its nest? Well, whatever may be the case for mammals and birds, most would draw the line at inset. As Karl Marx opined in the first volume of Kapital, this is Marx, what from the very first distinguishes the most incompetent architect from the best of bees is that the architect has built a cell in his head before he constructs it in wax. So even the most awful architect at least has an idea of what he's building. The bee has no idea at all. He just builds it. So here's a comparison of the beehive and the modern architecture that is built based on the beehive formula. So makers might be practically inept, says Marx, but at least they have their plans. And it's the work of making, in the work of making, those plans are realized in some raw material. That's to say, a form that is initially immaterial is joined with material that is initially formless to produce an artifact that unites both form and meaning. This is the so-called hylomorphic model of making, from the Greek hyle, meaning material, plus morphe, meaning form. So it's material plus form. And this model, this hylomorphic model of making, has come down to us all the way from Aristotle. In his Metaphysics, Aristotle asks us to imagine a bronze statue. I mean by matter, says Aristotle, I mean by matter bronze. By form, the figure of the idea, and by that which is composed from these, the whole statue. So this is Aristotle. You take a piece of metal, you take an idea, you unite the two, and you end up with a finished form, a statue. So the sculptor, in this instance, begins with the figure in his imagination and finishes with the monument. And in between start and end points, however, stuff happens. Materials are mixed, bent, shaped, transformed. There's a sort of growth, a becoming, but it's a growth that is bracketed between the start and end points of making, between the initial idea and the final form. And we could call that growing in making. So that's in that top diagram here. I stands for idea, O stands for object. So you start with an idea, you end with an object. There's some stuff we call growing that happens in between, but that growing is encompassed within the overall process of making that takes us from the idea to the object. That's the hylomorphic theme. And that indeed is how it might look to a visitor coming from outside the working environment, such as a client, a customer, or an owner-manager, with little or no practical experience of what actually goes on in the making process itself. So the visitor would recognize the end results and judge them by comparison with initial expectations, while preferring not to dwell on what happens in between. So growing is hidden inside the box of making. Researchers with backgrounds in cognitive psychology who are trained to place the operations of the intellect before their practical enactments, whether bodily or mechanical, are inclined to adopt a similar perspective. For example, Joy Paul Guilford, a pioneer in the study and measurement of human intelligence and a founding figure in the psychology of creativity, Guilford, back in the late 1930s, asserted of all human inventions that, and I quote, they are present in thought before they appeared in a tangible form. So they're there in the thought first, and then they appear as artifacts. For Guilford, the creative part of invention is attributable entirely to the capacity of the brain to reassemble ideas into novel combinations. Were it not for this capacity, he thought, there could be no arts, no culture, indeed no civilization worthy of the name. And translated into the world of commerce, of course, we find the same logic at work in the attribution of product innovation to the intelligence of a design process that lies in the novel recombination of ideas. The rest is mere execution. And indeed, much of the hype that currently surrounds making taps into these preoccupations. From fab labs to sandpits, places of making are turned into havens for self-styled creatives to engage in tournament of intellectual juggling or bricolage, while the productive engagement with materials that actively gives rise to things is reduced to little more than the three-dimensional equivalent of a printout. Though I should perhaps add that this reduction is more a feature of the hype than perhaps practitioners themselves might hold a rather different view. But washed in the high tide of postmodern consumerism, the novelty of ends always triumphs over the promise of perpetual beginning. And yet, for practitioners who are inside the process, in amongst the stuff and tackle of their trade, this promise is paramount. The promise of perpetual beginning. All in what they do move stuff across a threshold from old life to new. And that's what I've shown in the bottom diagram, from one process of growing through a transition to another process of growing. Think of the potter giving clay from the soil a new lease of life in the emerging form of a vessel, much as the hands of the midwife deliver new human life into the world. Or think of the shipwright introducing timber felled from the forest to a new life at sea. Or think of the weaver turning fleece that once grew on the backs of animals into cloth to cover the bodies of human wearers. The anthropologists among you who know of the classic study by Malinowski of the Trobriand Islanders, he speaks of how the Trobriand Islanders cut the tree growing from the forest, haul it down to the village where the canoe builder gets to work, digs out the canoe, they pull it to the beach, and off it sails into its new life as a canoe on the ocean. That's a wonderful example of this one process of growing at the tree in the forest, coming another process of growing of the canoe in the ocean, and the maker there standing at the threshold, taking it from one life and ushering it into another one. And that is what I mean by making in growing. From the inside, the maker, or for the inside perspective, the maker reappears as a demiurge who stands on the cusp, tasked not with bringing matters to a head or designs to their conclusion, but with launching new beginnings, giving birth to a world. And makers in this sense can still be conjurers. They can still be bricoleurs. There is a deviousness in their art and a capacity for improvisation that aims as much to get around things as to join them up. But the improvisation of making in growing is quite the opposite of the innovation of growing in making. It is the fount of renewal rather than the hallmark of novelty. Real bricoleurs, this is unlike their fictional counterparts immortalized by the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss in his comparison of the bricoleur with a thinker compelled to work with a limited set of heterogeneous elements whose kaleidoscopic mind forms new connections with every shake of its fragmentary content. You remember this is Lévi-Strauss's bricoleur who shakes things up, gets new patterns every time. Unlike that imaginary bricoleur of Lévi-Strauss, the real bricoleur has a feel for the materials with which they work and breathes new life into them even in the course of their recomposition and reuse. As even Lévi-Strauss admits, this is in the book, very badly translated as The Savage Mind, now much better translated as Wild Thought, La Pensée Sauvage. This is even Lévi-Strauss admits that the verb bricoler in French, bricoler, from which bricoleur comes, originally indicated, and I quote, a movement of the expected path, a swerve. So it's like going along and you go like that. It's interesting, actually. I don't know how it works in Spanish, but we have actually the closest equivalent to the word bricolé in English is to tack. And the tack is, we tack things together when you make a temporary fix. But the tack is also the maneuver on a ship where you're sailing against the wind and you have to go this way and then this way and this way. So it's swerving against an irregular course. And it's also the tackle, which is used fixing the breastplate of a horse to make sure the rider doesn't fall off, and also I've forgotten the other one, but never mind. It's all sorts of interesting meanings that where bricolage is not about just putting bits and pieces together, but about swerving. Oh, I remember the other one. To tackle, when you play football or rugby, you're tackling the other player who's coming at you, and you go like this to get around him. So that is really what bricolage is about. The swerve that's in the movement itself, not just fixing things together. So with making in growing, you enter into the grain of your materials, causing the course of each to deviate in such a way that they not only adhere, stick together, but cohere, holds together. That is to say, they're not just added up like fragments of a mosaic, but go along together like the strands of a weave. So time enters constitutively into the process of production. So then, what happens to the imagination? We don't deny that the maker has an idea in mind, but ideas don't come out of nowhere. Nor can their manufacture be attributed on the model of growing and making to a prior intention or design, as if the idea itself were first shaped by uniting the design with the formless material of thought. Because this logic would only lead to an infinite regress. We would have to posit inside the mind of the maker another mind that makes its ideas, and inside that another, and so on. And this regress is the curse of cognitivism, which looks ever inwards for the ultimate source of creative endeavor. But imagination is not on its own, nor does it conclude with the idea. On the contrary, to imagine is to mix and stir the ferment of one's own thinking with the generative fluxes of a world that is ever on the boil. Or in the fecund words of the anthropologist Stuart McLean, it is to respond creatively to the creativity of the world's ceaseless self-transformation. So the imagination of the maker is already dreaming of the new life the stuff they're working with will lead, even as the acts of making birth them into it. So rather than beginning with the idea and ending with the object, with growing in between, here both idea and object are cast together in the slipstream of the ever-growing correspondence of materials and imagination, that is, making in growing. But this is true of people too. And indeed, the distinction I've just drawn between growing in making and making in growing applies just as well to the human life cycle as to other things made and grown. It's conventional, at least in so-called Western societies, to assume that growth in both body and mind is confined to the life cycle of the individual. It starts at conception at which point it is supposed that a program is already downloaded for the individual's subsequent development, laid down in their genetic constitution. But for human beings, any such program would appear so loosely specified as to be insufficient on its own to set a viable life course. Instead, it is understood to direct the individual to acquire further information from others of its kind, whether they be parental figures or others who serve in one way or another as mentors. So in a word, the individual is required to learn. You come into the world with a set of genetic specifications already in place, and they say you must acquire some more specifications. Culture, get your culture here. And so as a shorthand for the content of what is learned, it has become usual to co-opt the concept of culture. So accordingly, the individual is set up with a dual prospectus, part genetic, part cultural, in the expectation that they will devote their life to its fulfillment. So life begins with the formal prospectus, along with the material resources of the environment, and ends with its realization in the world. So growth, or more generally, or more technically, ontogenesis, is what happens in between. And this is equivalent to growing in making. So, so I'll come back to that in a minute. So this picture of ontogenesis as the lifetime expression of a legacy comprised of both innate and acquired traits is so mainstream that it has passed largely unquestioned into the literatures of biology, psychology, and education. And it implies a radical distinction between the transmission of information across generations, whether by genetic replication or cultural learning, and the expression of information within generations. This is what I've tried to show on this slide here. So in standard biology, there's a vertical transmission, which they call phylogenesis, by which your genes are passed down from parents to child, and then the process of ontogenesis, which is the realization of that transmitted program in your own lifetime. So you devote your life to realizing the program that has been bestowed upon you at the point of conception in the genotype that you inherit. And psychologists have used exactly the same model when they say there's a process of transmission, which they call social learning, whereby the cultural information is deposited into your head, and then a process of what they call individual learning, in which that is written out in the course of the life cycle. So the process this picture of ontogenesis as the lifetime expression of a legacy comprised of both innate and acquired traits is so mainstream that it is passed largely unquestioned into the literatures of biology, psychology, and education. So it implies this radical distinction between the transmission of information across generations, whether by genetic replication, as in the first diagram, or cultural learning in the second, and the expression of information within generations. And only the latter is a life process. The former is not. Some researchers have extended the concept of learning to cover both, through the introduction of this further distinction I just mentioned between social and individual learning. Social learning, in their understanding, in their definition, social learning refers to the intergenerational transmission of cultural content. Individual learning refers to the way recipients adjust or fine-tune their behavior as they put the acquired information into practice within particular environmental contexts of action. But these terms, social and individual learning, are profoundly misleading. Because on the one hand, a learning that adapts and responds to a context that necessarily embraces human and non-human others can be nothing if not social. And on the other hand, to model learning as the transmission of information is to relate both source and recipients for the purpose of analysis, is to isolate both source and recipients for processes of analysis from any relational involvement, whatever. Indeed, the supposition that knowledge is acquired through social learning independently and in advance of its practical application in the world leads to an infinite regress of a kind that we've already encountered with the logic of growing in making. And here it comes down to the question of meaning. Gifted with language, humans can tell of their plans. They can, in principle, explain what's to be done in words, possibly augmented by additional nonverbal signs. And others, keen to know, can listen. But if they are to learn anything at all, these signs must also carry some meaning. Now, in the transmission model, this meaning must come pre-attached. For how else could it be imported, ready-made, into context of action? Yet, if the meaning of a sign is to be read off in advance of its engagement, then the recipient needs already to be in possession of a key. And just as in reading a map, you have to know what its symbols mean before you set foot in the territory. So how then is the key to be transmitted? Only by encoding it in another set of signs, which in turn would require yet another key to be read, and so on ad infinitum. And this is what leads the cognitive scientist, Philip Johnson Laird, to the conclusion that all social learning is ultimately founded in innate, that is, genetically transmitted attributes. You can learn to learn, Johnson Laird admits, but then that learning would depend on another program, and so on. Ultimately, learning must depend on innate programs to make programs. Yet, switching the channel from cultural to genetic transmission doesn't obviate the problem. Because if, as the evolutionary theorist John Maynard Smith insists, genes are to transmit information independently of their subsequent expression in ontogenesis, then again, they must carry some definite semantic content. They have to mean something. The individual is said to receive this meaning at the very start of life and in ontogenetic development to transmit it into the mature form. Yet, how can this meaning be received unless some code is already in place by which it can be read from the genetic script? And needless to say, no such code has ever been discovered. Instead, biologists have resorted to a circular logic by which meanings abstracted from developmental outcomes are read into the genes as though they were there from the start and were responsible for bringing the outcomes about. So the basic fallacy, in the words of the philosopher of biology, Susan Oyama, is to suppose that information can pre-exist the processes that give rise to it. You see the circularity. You read the information off from the outcomes of development, put it inside the genes to start off with, and then say, oh, look, the genes have read out, come with precisely the outcome we expected. It's an entirely circular logic. Now, there's only one way to get around this fallacy, and that is to acknowledge that the meanings of words, as indeed the meanings of genes, are not pre-attached, but gathered from the very processes of ontogenetic development, that is, of growth, in which they are in play. So life is not the expression or realization of a prospectus already written for it, but the never-ending process of writing and rewriting the prospectus itself. And that is making in growing. As the philosopher José Ortega y Gasset put it, human beings are auto-fabricators. They make themselves and each other in the crucible of their common life. What they are or what they are destined to be is fixed neither in nature nor in tradition, but is always work in progress, for which they bear a collective responsibility. And every step of fabrication, far from moving a life ever closer to its preordained conclusion, or as educationalists want to say, far from fulfilling their potential, opens up to renewed possibility. So each of us, at every moment of our lives, stands upon the cusp, taking in the experience of life lived thus far and releasing it into new beginning. Life may indeed be infused with potential, but this potential is not a limited good of a kind that would ultimately be drained in its fulfillment. It is rather what the philosopher of education, Tyson Lewis, calls pure potentiality, freed from its subservience to actualization. So what really goes on when people learn things? Engaged in a common task, they may vary in proficiency and experience. Some, as in this apprentice workshop here, some are already masters, others are still novices. As the former, as the master, demonstrates what to do, the latter, the novice, observes intently, coordinating their observations with their own movements so as to get the feel of things for themselves. So after much practice, novices eventually grow to be as proficient as their erstwhile mentors, only to become mentors in their turn. Now, looking back, we might remark on how the knowledge of one generation of practitioners has been successfully restored in the next, albeit not without stylistic variation or even improvement. But to pretend that this knowledge has been transmitted is to start from the wrong end. Cross-generational stability is a measure of the convergence of developmental outcomes, not of the transmission of formal models for enacting them. Or as the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu has it, wrote long ago, in learning, the novice copies not models, but other people's actions. So here, the apprentice is learning how to work with a hammer, under the observation of the master. He's getting the feel of it for himself. That knowledge is growing in him. It's not being transmitted. Eventually, he'll know everything that his master does, but not because it's been handed down, but because he has grown into that knowledge under the master's gaze, under the master's observation. So, and so meaning then arises out of the action. It's discovered a posteriori, not transmitted a priori. And it's in the wealth of meaning that practitioners draw from the collective experience of carrying out a range of tasks in an environment that their cultural knowledge resides. Far from being transferred intact from master to novice, it is continually co-produced in the course of their collaboration. Yeah, this is a process in which knowledge is being co-produced, not in which knowledge is being transmitted. So knowledge does not descend from generation to generation, but is regrown in each through their practical overlap as generations carry on their lives together. And what every generation brings to the next are the conditions of development for this regrowth to occur. So it follows that practices are not passed on through social learning, nor are they subsequently implemented through individual learning. They are ever produced anew, or literally reproduced, in the context of environmentally situated collaborative work. So in short, the distinction between social and individual learning is inapplicable to any real-world context of intergenerational collaboration. They're but two words, in individual social learning are but two words for the same thing, namely a process of mutual attention and response that tends towards convergent outcomes. So on the top diagram, this is how social learning theorists imagine it. There's in each generation, generation 1, generation 2, generation 3, there's you first learn, then you make, then you learn, then you make, then you learn, then you make. In the model that I'm proposing, the generations overlap, remember, like those lines of a braid, and as one is making, generation 1 is making, generation 2 is learning, who will eventually make and become a teacher in their turn, and so it carries on through the generation. Over a century ago, the great philosopher of education, John Dewey, argued that the values and beliefs of a social group, the values and beliefs that a social group seeks to engender in its immature members cannot be instilled by what he called direct conveyance. They can only be learned indirectly, he said, through the intermediacy of the environment. And since it is about opening up to others, attending to them, and attuning to their doings in one's own developing capacity to respond, learning, as Dewey recognized, is intrinsically ecological. And this means thinking again about generations. We tend to imagine every generation as a cohort that occupies its own slice of time in a sequence in which each is destined to replace its predecessor. So generations follow one another like layers in a stack, as in that first picture I put up, with earlier generations sinking ever further into the past as later ones are layered on top. I'll just go back to it. There. So that's in that diagram on the right. So with this stratified conception of intergenerational succession, each generation as a captive of its own time can receive nothing from the past except that which can be represented in some transmissible form independently of its lifetime achievement. And that's the source of the distinction between individual and social learning. The one, a life process, and that individual learning is a life process but not intergenerational. Social learning is intergenerational but not a life process. But an ecology of learning puts paid to this distinction because it forces us to recognize that generations are not layered vertically, but aligned longitudinally. That's there. We could picture them perhaps as strands of a plaited braid. Every strand is only so long, but as fast as old strands give out, new ones are introduced so that the braid itself can continue indefinitely. And what holds it together and prevents it from unraveling is the friction of their contact. And so it is that by carrying on their lives together, the old and the young can together lay an assured path for generations to come. Throughout history, indeed, this is predominantly how human lives have been lived. Youngsters have grown up learning the stories and observing the practices of their elders, both discovering the meanings of the stories and developing skills of practice in the passage of their own experience, and then becoming storytellers and practitioners in their turn. And yet, by and large, this is no longer true today. There is no expectation in our modern world for generations to work together. On the contrary, each generation takes it upon itself to rework the legacy of the past into novel formations. Innovation, not renewal, is the name of the game. But the reasons for this shift in how we think about life and learning are complex, having much to do with capitalism's erosion of domestic modes of production and with the redeployment of educational functions from the family to the state. And these are beyond the scope of what I have to say today, though we might return to them in discussion. But I want to conclude with some remarks on the implication of the approach to learning I've outlined for what we commonly call the curriculum. Because if, as I suggested, learning is a process of renewal that continually turns endings into beginnings, if it is ever on the threshold of new life, then we can hardly think of it as proceeding through a pre-mandated steps towards a conclusion. So how in that case can there be such a thing as a curriculum? The word curriculum comes from the Latin correre, meaning to run. It literally means a running course, like a racetrack. But what is a course, and what does it mean to run it? And to this, the spectator and the athlete might give different answers. In the eyes of the spectator, the course has a definite starting point and a finishing line, and the challenge is to make it from start to finish without hesitation or deviation. But for the athlete, there is more to running than that, because every race run is part of a process of growth or self-improvement that, like life itself, is far from straight, but weaves in and around the events of track and field, neither beginning nor ending anywhere in particular. So could we perhaps rethink the curriculum from the angle of the athlete? In what might be called the standard model of academic pedagogy, the course is designed to transfer a body of authorized knowledge from teacher to student, and completion is marked by an assessment to confirm successful accomplishment. But what if it were otherwise? What if our pedagogic aim were not to work towards the closure of a subject or topic fully understood, but to open a path and to follow where it goes? And what if this aim were not relegated to the margins of the academy, as at present, but placed at its heart? This is what it means to put making back inside growing. As the athlete runs for life and not just to cross the finish line, So the artisan seeks fulfillment in the practice of a craft, and the scholar seeks learning through study. In a now classic essay entitled On Intellectual Craftsmanship, the sociologist C. Wright Mills describes how the scholar, as much as the artisan, forms his own self as he works towards the perfection of his craft. Making for the artisan, as much as study for the scholar, is a way of growing into knowledge as knowledge grows in them. And this parallel between craft and study applies even to the most nominally academic of disciplines. It's not that some subjects are so theoretical, so enveloped in propositional language that they can be learned only through formal instruction, and other subjects so practical, so resistant to verbal expression that they can be learned only by doing. At the end of the day, as the biochemist and theoretician of chaos Otto Rössler once remarked, mathematics is no more than pottery. Let's go back to a slide I forgot to show. There, that's mathematics. Point. But he might as well have said that pottery is no less than mathematics, or indeed that craft as a way of making in growing is the equal of any philosophy. In pottery, as in mathematics, of course, bodies are at work. The making in growing that making in growing involves bodily activity goes without saying. It is, however, a great mistake perpetrated by generations of social theorists to jump to the conclusion that the skills of making are therefore embodied. Literally, the M of embodiment signifies an infolding or wrapping up. In this vein, the sociologist Lois Vacant asserts that the maker's body receives its quota of practical knowledge, he says, as a sediment. For every one of us, Vacant argues, such knowledge is gradually deposited as the layered product of our varied individual and collective history. But the body is not a sink, nor is knowledge a sediment. Skills are not implanted, as Vacant contends, but grown. Indeed, the idea of embodiment gets us nowhere in understanding the intense concentration and heightened kinesthetic awareness of skilled performance. This is the activity of a body that has not sunk into itself, but rather overflows with vitality. It bubbles up and spreads itself about, not only as it makes in gestures of the hand, but also as it speaks in gestures of the voice. Speaking, in short, is no less bodily and no more embodied than making. More often than not, they go along together. And this should put paid once and for all to the belief that makers cannot speak of what they know, and with it that words are the preserve of an intellect that has lifted off from immediate worldly involvement. The idea, first adumbrated by the philosopher Karl Polanyi, that maker's knowledge is tacit, both wordless and silent, has since become part of the analyst's stock in trade. And yet its effect has been to stifle the voices of makers themselves. Are they really so dumb as to need social theorists to speak on their behalf? In truth, the knowledge of the maker is not tacit, but kinetic, not embodied, but immanent in the movement of a body that is alive and attentive to its milieu. Appeals to the embodied or tacit nature of craft knowledge serve only to perpetuate its expulsion to the margins of the academic curriculum. The fact is that craftspeople are thinkers, just as scholars are, and can be as eloquent about their disciplines as anyone else. Conversely, scholarship would dry up were it not animated by bodily experience with vital materials. And it is by restoring craft to scholarship or making to learning, and not by opposing them along the lines of a dichotomy between embodiment and verbalization, that we can finally arrive at the curriculum vitae in its strict sense, not a record of races won and medals awarded, but as the course of a life. Thank you very much.
Hello. First of all, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I want to go back to your discussion about the development of human life. I have for a long time read your criticism to the neo-evolutionary synthesis. This about the genetic information predisposition and so on. And every time I talk about this with friends, the same argument always presents. The argument is, okay, but what about kids that look so much like their parents, or even beyond that? What about my baby that their facial gestures look like my parents' ones? So I wonder, like, I never really know what to say to that argument, and I wonder if it's more related to pattern recognition biases or so on. How would you address that argument? Thank you.
Of the developmental systems that are pretty much the same for everybody, and some that are very different. So if I can just, I'll come back to your particular example, that if you compare, say, the skills of walking and the skills of playing a musical instrument, you'd say that just barring handicap, accident, just about all human infants end up walking on 2 feet. But only a minority of humans learn to play the oboe. So for each of those, certain conditions must be in place for these skills to emerge. And it happens that the conditions for developing walking, so long as there's ground that you can walk on, you know, that skill is going to develop. It doesn't mean that it's determined entirely by the genes. It simply means that there are parts of the developmental system that are pretty reliably present for everyone. So it's the same, I think, with the color of your eyes, the shape of your nose, and so on, that these also are the result of a developmental process, but the variations in that process are almost all on the side of the genetic input to it, and not on the side of the environment. That doesn't mean that they're genetically determined, but it means that genetic variation has the greatest influence on the outcome. But it's really a hard argument to make to people who are not convinced of it already.
Do you hear me? Yes. First of all, thanks. I'm not an anthropologist, so my question is going to come from a different field. And I'm sorry if it's out of the context, but the difference between making and growing made a hole in my head right now, because I'm working with a small community in a small, not even a, it's a small port. It's not even a port. It's like 200 people living there. And I did a series of photography with them, trying to show their daily work. And your difference between making and growing made sense within their work. They're working with something that is unique at this moment and it's getting extinguished because of capitalism, etc. So how can I approach, under this distinction, the growing and the making with their processes? I mean, I know it's hard to explain, but I'm trying to, I got the idea and I'm trying to get that idea within the visual work that I'm working. I don't know if it makes sense. How is it possible to take the learning and the knowledge of the generation that you were talking, bringing it within these layers of generation and trying to make it visible without making that separation that you were claiming that you were that it's not making with this distinction? I don't know if the question makes any sense. I'm just trying to, I got your idea and I tried to, I want to know how to apply it visually, if it's possible by any means, without words. That's the thing.
Yeah. So I repeat the sentiment. Thank you so much for coming here and for your speech and sharing your knowledge with all of us. My question poses upon the topic, the ever-growing topic of AI in creative fields, because as someone who draws low-key for a living, I'm constantly worried that machines and upgrowing technology will replace this the process of learning and growing, because it is always discussed in these circles that leaving everything to machines will stunt the ever-growing process, as I said, of learning with one's hands, as it has something to do with muscular memory and the repeating process, the failure, the success, and everything in between is put on stake because of that. And the debate is on what are your thoughts on the involvement or the level of involvement that machines and artificial intelligence should have on those fields? Because as someone has said that humanity has the unique trait of learning and growing of it, but machines don't have that human factor in it. They just do it. They don't grow. I mean, they could grow because they're being trained. But in and all, what are your thoughts upon that machines learning and trying to mimic humanity in those same processes?
Hi, I wanted to take a little bit of what you said, but more than AI, more like technology in general, specifically maybe like social media or just these things that we have. Because I've noticed, at least for example, in my family, that all of the little kids in the family know how to use a phone. And instead of observing the people around them and learning from them, like what you were saying, which is a really interesting idea because I really like it because it's true to some extent. But now it's been lost in the sense that kids use phones and tablets and everything, and they get a lot of their learning from there, and they're not really connected to the like real world in that sense. And I wanted to know how that could change, or how that could be approached from your ideas, maybe. I don't know if I'm explaining myself correctly, but yeah.
The question is, if one's going to shift from a more conventional perspective, that what happens to stuff goes on within the process of making, to the perspective I've suggested, in which making itself is part of the growth process. How is one going to get that idea across to a community of practitioners who are used to the idea that they're making this or they're making that? And I think a lot of it has to do with the status we attach to the world. And we're using words to explain things. And the common way of using words to explain things today in educational context is that the people say, this is what we're doing, this is how we're supposed to do it. Now we should get on and try it out. So that the words that are being used are explicatory, they're propositional. And I think one of the implications of a shift to thinking about making in growing is that we also shift our register of language. We start to think of words much the way that traditional practitioners would use them in storytelling. One would tell the story, one would not explain, would not tell people this is what we're doing and this is how to do it, but we would rather use words to echo the process of our doing. It is the stories themselves, as they are told, would educate not in telling people what to do, but in saying you understand the meaning of the story when you find yourself in a situation when you say, oh, this is what the story was telling me about. Now I know how to proceed. So it's something to do with that. I think one has to bring in the words and stories and how we use words to answer that question. On the issue of AI, I should own up to being a inveterate technophobe. I hate all this stuff, and I'm definitely 110% against artificial intelligence. I don't think it will bring any benefit whatever to humankind. I think it's an instrument of corporate surveillance and profiteering, and that we should be doing all we can, not just to regulate it, but actually to get rid of it. How to do that, I don't know. That's more of a problem. But I think, I also think that whether we succeed in getting rid of it or not, it's going to self-destruct anyway. I don't believe that it's remotely sustainable. And I'm pretty sure that, this is my view anyway, that by the end of this century, probably, most of what we know as the digital economy, the digital infrastructure, will have become extinct because it turned out to be completely unsustainable. And that's why I think it's really important that we look after the crafts, the skills that our descendants will need in a post-digital world. So that's where I stand on that issue. And the difficulty when it comes to things like learning a craft is that the idea of artificial intelligence is modeled on an extremely impoverished idea of what intelligence is. It's a model of idea of what intelligence is that comes predominantly from the cognitive sciences, that is uninformed by what we know from research in semiotics, in phenomenology, in many other fields, which are more sensitive to the depth of perceptual involvement of practitioners with the world around them. And that is not something that depth of involvement, that way in which we are sensorially coupled with the environments and the materials that we deal with, is not something that AI is even designed to replicate. What AI does instead is to reformulate ways of making so as to get rid of, so to do without that kind of sensorial involvement. So for example, this is not AI, but a 3D printer. You simply program the printer and it will produce an object that might look like an exact replica of something you wanted to create, but completely bypassing any sensory involvement of the maker with materials. That's what AI is trying to do. And I would oppose it because I think this represents an extraordinary impoverishment of human experience. It actually leads to, it diminishes, it significantly diminishes our humanity. So that's why I would, I think we need to oppose it. Then there's a question about phones and other things. The question has sometimes been posed in this way, that isn't it a good thing that nowadays this kind of skilled knowledge and craft that you're talking about is being democratized, and the internet has made possible this democratization. Now, if you want to do something practical and you're not quite sure, you'll find a YouTube video which will tell you, and you'll learn very soon, just try out a few times, and the video will help you, and you'll be able to do it for yourself. Therefore, skills that were once the preserve of certain trades, you have a plumbing problem, whatever, you don't have to call a plumber, you can do it yourself. The skills that were the product of particular trades are now open to all. Isn't that a good thing? And I think actually, no, it is not a good thing, because the democratization of skills also leads to their homogenization and flattening. Imagine an orchestra in which, a symphony orchestra, in which every musician kind of knew how to play every instrument, and compare that with an orchestra in which the strings, the woodwind and the rest, everyone has spent decades trying to master a particular instrument, and ask ourselves which would make the better sound. And the answer is kind of obvious. And I think that's how I would respond to that one.
Muchas gracias. Y ahora pasamos, tenemos espacio para 3 preguntas más. Hay una que quedó pendiente ahí, y después sacamos algunas del medio probablemente.
Hi, thanks so much for your lecture. I'm amazed for all the things you said. My question is more as an educator information. How can we teach from this perspective of yours? How can we optimize the making more than the learning? Or I don't know if I'm explaining me right.
Absolutely.
How can we teach our children from this perspective in a more tangible way, or can we teach ourselves to teach in your perspective?
Thank you very much for your lecture today. I'm actually like an undercover here because I'm not an anthropologist. I've studied arts. I'm a sculptor. So I cannot help but wonder when you make the like the analogy with the spectator and the athlete, like the practice-based research or arts-based research must be something like the athlete way of acquiring knowledge. So that's my question. And also when you were talking about tacking or tack, I thought about a tackle box that you carry with you when you go fishing. So you can have like lures that you can make depending whether what you need to catch. You might improvise and make a specific lure for a specific fish. Well, that's all. Thank you.
Una más.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk. I work in the field of childhood studies, so it's very interesting for me to think about this learning process, intergenerational learning processes, and your idea of co-producing knowledge. But I stayed thinking about the role of unmaking in this intergenerational learning process. So in the context of, for example, what you were saying about AI, but also in what we call the Anthropocene. So when the making of one generation becomes problematic for another generation, how do you think the role of unmaking, or even we could say destroying previous makings, does it have a real force in intergenerational learning? That's my question. Thank you.
Okay. The first question was about, thanks again for all your questions. And the first question is, how could one actually draw the approach I've been suggesting into the practical business of teaching in a classroom, teaching in a university, whatever. And it's not an easy question to answer. And partly because we're all operating as university or school or university teachers within an institutional context that is designed on the model that I've been critiquing. So that it means going against the grain, it means being subversive in a way. As indeed I was myself. For many years I designed and taught a course in my own University of Aberdeen called the 4 A's, Anthropology, Archaeology, Art and Architecture, and we deliberately set out to do things along the lines I suggested. And it was all done sort of, one of the things you had to write a document giving the course objectives and course outlines and what students are supposed to do. And I love being able to write in this document, you are not expected to write in Times New Roman 12 points on a word processor. You are expected to write by hand and compare what that feeling of writing by hand, how does that link you to what you're writing about? What difference does it make? So So one had to break with the rules. But one way to think about it is to learn from those areas which are currently somewhat marginal to the academic curriculum, where this way of learning is normal. I'm thinking particularly in areas of craft, things like metalwork, woodwork in school, sport sometimes, music tuition. These are all normally taught in a much more hands-on way, and they're classified as non-academic compared with the academic subjects that are taught in the traditional way. And I think what would be great is if we could get rid of that academic, non-academic distinction and allow the experience and know-how of teaching in these so-called non-academic areas to help us work on delivering teaching within more traditionally academic fields. But it's not an easy thing to do because the institutional structures are so entrenched. You asked about the artist here, and I would think about the artist in just the same way as the athlete in this sense. Artists are doing it for life, and they might have to complete a piece of work now, but every moment of completion is just a step along the way. It's like just as the athlete, you run a race, and then there's the next race, and then there's the next one, and that's part of the process of becoming yourself in and through the art of running. And I think it's the same for the artist. It's only for the outside world that the art consists of fixed things that are then exhibited or sold, just like with the runner, that you won that race and you've won that race. So that the analogy is very good. And of course, you're right. Just that in English we talk about fishing tackle. If you go, I can't fish, but if you go fishing, you have your tackle, which is all these little different kinds of hooks you have in your box, and different lines and the rods, and that all of that is your tackle. And it's actually a wonderful example, because then if you watch a fisherman, say a rod and line fisherman, and he's sitting on the bank of the river and he's holding his rod and looking for the fish, and the whole thing about catching a fish is in the swerve. The hook catches on the fish, and the fish's line of flight is suddenly diverted, and then whoops, it's lifted out. So it's a beautifully athletic movement that is done through the tackle, which is so different from the way Lévi-Strauss classically thought about it, as this disassembly and reassembly of bits and pieces. And the last question about unmaking, that too is really, really interesting. A few years ago, I attended a small workshop, mostly of archaeologists in Reykjavik, Iceland, and the theme was undoing. And the argument was that in archaeology, we haven't really talked about what it means to undo things. It's now been published as a rather large edited volume, and I wrote a paper for it, and it made me think about what do we actually mean by undoing things. And I called my paper "The Doing in Undoing." The doing in undoing. That undoing something is something you do, and it really then challenges you to think about what doing really is, because it's not just. It comes back to this thing about bricolage. If you think of things as simply bits and pieces stuck together, then they hold together and they fall apart. But if you think of more in terms of the movement, the dynamic, the growth of things, then undoing is part of an ongoing process. And I just finished with a joke, because when I was thinking about this, it was at the time when our new king was having his coronation, and he had to ride from the Westminster Cathedral back to Buckingham Palace in a golden royal coach that was built, I think, in the 18th century and had been used by every monarch for this trip. And the thing is, it is the most uncomfortable vehicle anybody could possibly ride in, because as it goes down the road, it's got a sort of leather harness and it sways like this. They're going like this as you're going forwards. And Queen Victoria wrote in her diary that she had to make this trip and it was the most terrible. And she said, I was quite undone by it. And there's a phrase that she was that there was she became incoherent. And this cohering is this idea of it goes beyond adhering. By adhering, things are simply stuck together, but by cohering, they go along together and hold. And to be undone is to lose that sense of coherence that comes from this. Actually, the coach was doing bricolage. It was swerving from side to side as it moved forward. So it's really interesting to think about what unmaking is. If the original making is a kind of growing, then unmaking is a kind of growing too. It carries the process on.
Bueno, agradecemos a toda la gente que vino, agradecemos también al Laboratorio de Etnografía, al Núcleo Especulatorio, que también pronto estará sacando un diplomado en CTS, así que den un ojo a las redes, a la gente que estuvo organizando, Diego, Victoria, y un aplauso para todos ellos y por supuesto para el profesor Ingold, de quien estamos muy agradecidos.
Okay.